So my name is Andy McElroy, and I am the Senior Media Specialist for the Green Climate Fund, which is the world's largest multilateral climate fund based in South Korea, but with many investment projects here in Africa.
And can you tell us more about Green Climate Fund, what they actually do, and the project that it has invested in so far in this part of the world, say Sub-Saharan Africa?
Yes, of course. So every month we hear that the latest month is the hottest month on record. And when it comes to dealing with climate change, it's very easy to lose hope and to get a bit overwhelmed with the scale of the problem. But the Green Climate Fund still believes we have a great opportunity to build a more prosperous future for national governments, countries, and more importantly, of course, communities on the ground. So at a broad level, we have two types of investment. We invest in mitigation, which is to reduce the causes of generation of greenhouse gases. And we invest in adaptation, which is working with communities to help them adapt to secure a more prosperous future for them and their families. Now, the Green Climate Fund has access to capital at the international level thanks to the donations of national governments and also because of our partnership with the private sector. But what we don't have is the access and knowledge of the context on the ground. So this is where it's really important for the Green Climate Fund to work with national entities, whether it's here in Senegal or any country in West Africa, because these organizations know the opportunities and the challenges of how to address climate change far better than we do. So that's our business model, is we are investing in projects that really are focused on improving the lives and livelihoods of communities all around the world here in West Africa, across Africa. In fact, we have now, I think, 118 projects throughout Africa, working with smallholder farmers, for example, here in Senegal, addressing issues of salination, helping them to plant more salt-resistant rice, helping communities to manufacture and maintain their own compost so that they can generate farming that feeds their families and also generate a surplus that enables them to sell to market, giving them money for things like sending their children to school or whatever they think is the most important. And I'm delighted to be here for the conference organised by the African Union of Broadcasting. And I think it's really appropriate that we're speaking here today in Dakar on World Radio Day, because radio, even in this era of social media, radio still has a huge role in terms of connecting with communities on the ground, sharing information, catalysing dialogues with communities on critical issues, whether it's climate change or other issues that those communities are facing.
And talk about Green Climate Fund. How do NGOs, CSOs, or communities get access to you, supposing they need your intervention?
It's a very good question. And the Green Climate Fund has been operational now for 10 years. And we have faced in the past quite significant criticism, whereby our partners have accused us of saying that we are too slow, we're too bureaucratic, our processes are really quite complicated. So we've listened to those criticisms, and we are undergoing a major period of reform with the focus on being more fit for purpose to support country-led climate action. And such country-led climate action always has to be under the leadership of the national government. That's how we work. But we recognize that within that leadership, we need to be partnering more with national and local partners who understand the context of their community far better than we have, who have the trust and the credibility to work in those communities. So this is a strategic priority for us. And increasingly our partnerships are not with the international organizations as during the early days of the Green Climate Fund, but more and more we are partnering directly with national organizations. So I can give you one example here in Senegal. The Centre Suivi d'Écologique is a national partner that is accredited to partner with the Green Climate Fund. And 2 days before our conversation, I was out visiting the project work that they are implementing here in Senegal in a district called Fatick. And it was very impressive for me to see how this Senegalese organization understands the context, can mobilize local leadership, and can make connections with communities and other partners to ensure a partnership approach to climate action. Now, while GCF, Green Climate Fund, we have significant investments in one sense, although our total budget is still tiny in terms of the climate needs.
How tiny is it?
It's still tiny. We need to grow. But what I was really impressed with is the ability for CSE to connect and make the investment go far further than an international partner. So that was really impressive. And if I may, the other thing I would like to add, particularly when we talk about communities and countries in the Sahel region, which I think can fairly be said is on the very front line of climate change.
Do you have drought?
Exactly.
Wave.
And of course, a lot of the narrative and the conversation is on the vulnerability of communities, is on their exposure to hardships and the increasing prevalence of conflict and displacement.
Mm-hmm.
And these are absolutely real-world, present-day challenges. But I would also like to reference what I've seen in my limited time here is the resilience of those communities. And I think it's really important for partners such as the Green Climate Fund to recognize that this is an incredible resource that we can work with to address these major
problems. I really love that you said resilience, because I think after more than a decade of the fighting against climate change, I think we should go a bit past adaptation and mitigation measures to seeing how communities can build resilience to climate shocks. And so would you say the fact that you are here today commemorating the World Radio Day, but with particular emphasis on radio and its role in the fight against climate change, presents GCF and partners a better opportunity to connect with communities to better understand homegrown solutions that will work better?
I think that's an absolutely correct assessment. You're right to reference the fact here we are in 2025, almost 10 years after the Paris Agreement in December 2015. And while some progress has been made, really so much more needs to be made. And this is a challenge and a crisis that is manifesting itself in, if not daily, regular problems for communities around the world. And I think it's very important for us to recognize the role of community leaders, and I include the media in that description, because the basis of any effective climate action is twofold. One is access to climate information at the community level that enables them to make a better decision. It's not always the right decision, but the more access to useful, prompt climate information that communities have, then the more likely they will to avoid decisions that are not helpful for them in the medium and long term. So access to climate information, where radio, I think, has a key role. And the second element linked to this issue of climate information is trust. And I think community radio that have that regular dialogue, have that connection with the communities, rely on trust, because if that trust is broken, their whole business model and their ability to lead those conversations is gone. So I think the role of community radio, national radio, with the relationship they hold with their audience to maintain that credibility, to have tough conversations on the big issues of our time, which obviously includes climate change. I think from the Green Climate Fund's perspective, this positions the media at the local level, including radio, as really important partners in our collective effort on climate action.
And talk about collective action in the fight against climate change. Would GCF be expanding its scope of work or operations to now partner with, say, community or local media stations to better carry out this campaign?
I think the Green Climate Fund is best positioned to work with and through national level entities who in turn can partner with the local level. I think as an international entity, it's difficult for us to go local across the world. We just don't have the capacity. And we're also mandated to work with and through national governments in terms of the priorities that they've identified.
But if you walk through national governments, many will argue that sometimes these things come through, but then there is no transparency. And sometimes funds being meant for projects are not necessarily spent on this project. There's no monitoring, there's less evaluation. What's your take on that?
Well, I think from the Green Climate Fund's perspective, we have quite strict guidelines in terms of how the finance that we are responsible to channel through international national entities under the leadership of those national governments is really spent in the best way appropriate. So those guidelines are really in place. Now, to say, do we have challenges? Yes, of course. And we have mechanisms to address those challenges. And they involve a dialogue and a clear expectation. If things have gone wrong, then we will move to a position of addressing those wrongs and try to ensure that doesn't happen again. So I think it's always a balance. We are committed to increase access to our funding. That's critical. But we have to do it in a way that we're still responsible for the finance that has been entrusted for us to manage and channel to developing countries in their fight against climate change.
Absolutely. Just before I let you go, Mr. Andy, you talked about projects that GCF has across the continent. But you just mentioned one in Senegal, or you gave a few examples in Senegal. Which other countries would you want to mention here?
Okay, I could say next week we have a board meeting, and we have this 3 times a year. And the role of our board, which is 12 members from developing countries, 12 members from developed countries, they scrutinize and approve or not approve projects for implementation. And next week we have 12 projects coming up for approval. And these projects include a significant footprint here in Africa. So I can recall that there is projects that will have a focus on Burundi, for example, in Rwanda. In this part of the world, in West Africa, there is a project supporting Burkina Faso. So these are new projects coming up. In terms of existing projects, again, as I said earlier, we have a mandate to support in terms of adaptation towards resilience, as you rightly point out, but also in terms of mitigation to reduce the generation of greenhouse gas and to somehow capture the gases that have already been produced. So as of now, we have 118 projects in Africa, covering, if not a majority of African countries, I would say nearly a majority. And that's a total investment of $6 billion.
$6 billion.
Yeah, so it's quite a significant investment on the one hand, but when we all realize that the scale of the climate crisis requires trillions of dollars of investment in another way, it's still quite a small amount.
How are the most vulnerable in communities benefiting from this? And I mean, most vulnerable, I'll be talking about women and children.
Mm-hmm.
How is it benefiting from this?
So different projects will have different focuses. So I can say directly from a project I saw yesterday here in Senegal that focused on smallholder farmers adapting their farming practices in an area that has been salinized through salt intrusion. A lot of the work of that project was to support women-led community groups in terms of market gardens, in terms of managing compost, and just that sort of basic community leadership on stronger food security. So that's one project that I've seen directly. Elsewhere, GCF really has a major priority to try and focus on vulnerable groups. We have, for example, an Indigenous persons advisory group that advises the board. So that's a really important mechanism. And we also have quite significant social and environmental safeguards that are intended to protect the beneficiaries in our projects from any kind of abuse. That's really, really important. We have zero tolerance for that. But in terms of engagement at that political and influential level, we do have quite significant engagement with CSOs, with civil society organisations. They also have a observer status on the Green Climate Fund board. So next week in Korea, during those board discussions, the voice of the CSOs of civil society organizations will be heard in terms of their comments, both positive and negative, on some of the proposed work of GCF.
And finally, Mr. Andy, I'm very sure, if I'm wrong, correct me please, that you attended the first AUB summit on.
I did not. I'm making my debut at this.
This is your debut.
Yes.
This is your debut, and AUB has said it will continue to host media summits to contribute to the fight against climate change. But please tell me, what's your expectation, say in the next 5 years, regarding the climate emergency in Africa?
So I often describe myself as a 20th century journalist. That's when I began to work on newspapers, when the media landscape was completely different to the one we have now. And sometimes I wonder, because I grew up professionally in a different era, am I and are my principles still relevant in a 21st century media landscape that is very fragmented, whereby there's a saturation of information, there's a huge increase in mis and disinformation, there's a reduction in attention spans and a difficulty for any organization or outlet to connect and have a genuine dialogue. So I do reflect on all of that, but I keep coming to the same conclusion, that the fundamentals of good communication and good media engagement that I grew up on in the 1980s are still relevant in the 2020s. And that is about understanding the context of people's lives. That is about dealing with the issues that affect them day to day, rather than these, and in terms of climate change, that can be overly complex and abstract. But when it comes down to their lives on the ground, you can really make that connection. And it's also about communicating a message of optimism and hope that is credible, not delusional, that is credible. And sometimes it may be a bit difficult to go down that path with all the problems that we face. But I do feel those principles of good communication, of good journalism still stand. And so to answer specifically your question, the role of the AUB Media Summit on climate change, what I hope, and I'm already seeing...
And journalism in the whole, in Africa, and the fight against climate change.
Yeah, I think the two fundamentals are trust and credibility. Very hard to build up. I mean, I think your organization is a good example of diligence and consistency in building that reputation. Very hard to build trust, very hard to build credibility, very easy to lose it. So I think the message, and what I'm hearing from the journalists I'm talking to today, is they recognize this rather old-fashioned value of trust and credibility is a non-negotiable. And I think if we keep that as a media community, and individual journalists keep that, then we're still in the fight, not only on climate change, but on many other issues.
Thank you very much.